Now at the second section of this second lecture about Trumbo, which is called Life Without War, Human Resources and Memory. What I want to just look at briefly is basically what does Joe have to call on? And this sort of points to who are we without our stuff? I mean, if all the stuff behind me didn't exist, who would I be? What would I remember? What I have in my head? And the issue really is, to some extent, how much memory do we have about our lives? Where would we wind up living? If memory was an island, how big would the island be? How much space would be there? How much of your life would you remember? And what would you have to go to? What would you have to visit? And this is the kind of thing that happens to us when we're ill, or when we may be stranded somewhere. If you've been stuck in an airport for 10 or 12 or 14, God help you, hours. I'm sure we all have been at some point. What resources do you have? Because it's like what's in your head. And so Joe has to go through this. He's never had to go through this before. He's been living in a sensory environment, and he's used all his senses. So on page 96, he has to figure himself out. Right? He's got to figure out who he is. He had just felt the nurse's hands, and the nurse's hands were real. So when he felt them, he was awake. 96. This is the fundamental understanding of, again, the school of Greek thinkers who became known as the solipsists, who fundamentally believe that the world was built around them, and there are people who believe this. I mean, there are people who believe effectively that they are the center of the world, and that if they were to die, the whole world will die. And to some extent, that's true, in the sense that if they were to die, their world does die. What they would argue is that everybody else winks out of existence at the same time, where the rest of us would say, no, we keep existing. This is the sort of, who is the dreamer and the dreamed, and, are we dreaming of the butterfly? Is the butterfly dreaming of us? So it's this, heavy man. But the idea really is, what makes the world real for you? How do you know the world is real? And there is a time when, if somebody comes and touches you, you're like, oh, I'm in the world now, because they're waking you up, and they're saying, somebody outside you is here and is making your reality more vivid and more real. For the solipsists, they would say, no, that's just an illusion because your senses are lying to you, which again we saw with 300, remember, and this is the same idea as the Stoics and the Spartans, which is that fundamentally our senses are busy lying to us, and what makes the world is rational thought and law. Math. And Joe considers this, and he says on 100, maybe nothing was real, not even himself. Oh God, and wouldn't that be wonderful? So he's faced with this, to some extent, reminds me of that sort of pain cry of first year students, in especially in first term, who at some point say, does everything have some meaning? Isn't anything just plain? It's just on the surface. It has no deeper meaning. And we're all like, no, it all has a meaning. I just dig down deep. It all signifying. Those people hate that. I would say, yeah, no, everything does have a meaning. Everything is political. Like, well, Tim Hortons isn't political. It's like, of course it is. Are you kidding? Tim Hortons isn't political. Holy crap. Tim Hortons as opposed to Starbucks. What's the difference? It's like, it's a class difference. Come on, get a grip. Jeez. So Joe is confronted with this, by this, and he says on page 99, that meant no more of anything but thinking, 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 and this sort of sounds like not Wittgenstein, Heidegger, and he begins to think, and on page 125 he says the trouble with him was he didn't know anything, he didn't know a thing. Why hadn't they taught him something he could remember? Why didn't he have something to think about? Here he was with nothing to do but think, and he didn't have anything to fall back on. Now, this is a really interesting thing for me in the current moment. What have we filled our lives up with? And, if you are thrown back on everything you've done so far, and that's all you get. You don't get any more input than that. What are the music you remember? What about plays? Have you seen any plays? What films do you remember? What about books? Have you read any books? Do you remember them? Have you had meaningful experiences in your life that you were prepared to go back to and revisit? How many times? For how long? Basically, these are the sort of very troublesome kinds of questions that we, sooner or later in life, we sort of ask. It's like, are we just here? Like, is your job just to scroll through Instagram and Snapchat and LinkedIn and whatever it is? It's all the same stuff. Is that your thing? Like, how many of these posts, thousands of posts that we've seen, are memorable? Whose tweets do you remember? The great tweets of 2012. Like what? Can you remember a tweet from last year? How many? Can you remember 5, 10? So it's this sort of terrifying thing. And as he says on page 127, he might even have lost a year, 2 years. It was more of a panic. It was a panicky dread of losing yourself, even from yourself. And this is the fear of not having an internal being. What is the experience of the lived? What is your lived experience? How well are you in touch? To what extent are you in touch with it? And it's interesting. I mean, of course, what he comes to is on 144 and 145. He's going to come to this sort of a number of different places. He knew it wasn't true. Karine would never grow old. She was still 19. She would remain 19 forever. He could keep her safe beside him, young and beautiful, forever, safe from time, in a world he had built, where time moved according to orders, and every Sunday was spring. Right? So here is the power of memory, where Joe realizes that he creates the world. And as I say, this is often given as a sort of solipsistic view. But in his situation, the world does exist around him. He knows it, but he can't have any effect on it. Very little. Right? So here's an example of memory sort of being like a machine. And this touches off a whole huge discussion about memory, which we just don't have time for. But it's. I just want you to see that it's. I'm calling it out. Althusser is interpolating us. I'm interpolating this. Interpolate this, Althusser. So here's a little piece about memory.
Perfect condition. 236E.
Okay, just a little tiny bit of context about what you just saw. This is a fictionalized story by Costa Gavras called Music Box. It's amazing. Where Jessica Lange is a lawyer who is a very successful lawyer who leaves her business to jeez, to clear her father of being a war criminal. And she's been looking for evidence, and there isn't really anything. She's got her suspicions, but there isn't anything. And then finally, she picks up the music box. It's the very last thing that happens, and she turns it on. And as she turns it on, and there's astonishing, chilling quality to it. And it's one of these really. It's a 19th century music box. I mean, they're just amazing, and it contains essentially the memories, the hidden, forbidden memories of pictures of her father as a member of the Hungarian Arrow Cross. The Arrow Cross was the local Nazi chapter, basically. A number of the countries had their own Nazi movement, essentially, which then came into power as the Nazis rolled along. They were like, "Oh, okay, the Arrow Cross is all set up. You guys are, you guys are Nazi. You guys are our Nazis in Hungary. You'll take over the war crimes for us now," which they did. So what's happened though is, she she takes out a memory and another one pops up, and she takes out that memory and another one pops up, and it's like, you cannot stop the memories from coming.